everyone. Welcome. Thanks for being here. My name is Michelle Laboy. I'm actually filling in for the moderator, Phil Anderson. I'm also going to be presenting, so I'll try to improvise as best as I can. So we have with us Nathan Sanders from the Mystic River Watershed Association, who will be talking about water quality in Massachusetts. We also have Ahmed Halawani from Northeastern University, talking about bus routes and congestion in relationship to the poor. We have Eliza Wallace from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. Yes. Who will be talking about their work with NOAA in Boston related to climate adaptability. And I am Michelle Laboy from Northeastern University School of Architecture, and I will be talking about RHOnDA, which is a tool for disseminating information on resilience to the residential population. So the panel is on resilience, generally speaking. Resilience is something we probably are all interested in this room, but it's generally defined as the ability to adapt or bounce back or return to function, and in some cases it's also discussed as a kind of way of adapting to completely new normals, so completely new conditions. So it's not just about returning to an original state, but also having the ability to reorganize and adapt to a new situation. So that seems very timely today, given that we are faced with increasing threats of climate change, but there's also many other aspects of hazards in the environment, in the political and social environment that disproportionately affect the poor and the most vulnerable. So that's kind of the line that we're all trying to probably bring into this panel. So without further ado, I guess I'm starting since that was the original plan. So I will talk about RHOnDA, which is an online tool to disseminate resilience information to homeowners and tenants. Just wanted to briefly acknowledge the people who are funding this research and this work. The American Institute of Architects gave us a grant called the Option Research Initiative to develop the tool. In 2015-16, we've been working on that with also funding from the Northeastern University's Tier 1 Provost Seed Grant. These are my collaborators. Maybe I'll stand up so I can see the slides. These are my collaborators, David Fannin from the School of Architecture, jointly appointed with Civil Engineering, and Matthew Eckelman, also from Civil Engineering at Northeastern. And we have a fantastic student team who has been working with us and have been incredible. So these are some facts about the urban fabric. What we call the urban fabric is really what constitutes the majority of the built environment in cities. And thinking about cities as much larger than just the kind of urban cores, thinking about the kind of larger metropolitan regions. So some facts about that. 75% of the built environment in the United States is suburban. 50% of the building stock is expected to be remodeled by 2035. 5% of buildings globally are considered professionally designed. 4% of the architecture and engineering buildings in the U.S. are in multifamily housing, so a very, very small amount of the total investment of your architects and engineers in the built environment. And 2% of the homes in the U.S. are custom designed, which means they have an architect or an engineer working with the homeowner to design that home. So those are important facts to understand how little impact design professionals actually have in the built environment, which is a little frightening because we're facing some really great challenges. And part of that too is that in that process of adapting, many of people in the urban fabric are not having access to the kind of knowledge that's accumulating about resilience and how to make buildings more resilient. They have no access to the advice of professionals, which is, I would say, a barrier to adapting to these challenges. Now, this graph image that we created is to show kind of the relationship between buildings and the kind of what's been called the domains of resilience. The kind of CommPsych framework that includes the technological, organizational, social, and economical. Now, if you can see on the top right quadrant, it's what I call the technological aspects of architecture, which have to do, of course, with structure, energy, open space, and treatment of water and waste. But a whole 3/4 of that graph is actually things that we, as designers, don't necessarily control. The economic environment, social environment, or organizational environment. So in our work, we've taken the position that while it is important to understand how to adapt buildings physically, and there is a lot of intelligence to be gathered about it, resilience really is about people, and it's about the systems that support them and not necessarily just about protecting property. Unfortunately, a lot of the work in resilience that's been done relative to buildings is focused on high-value critical assets, not on the majority of the urban fabric, which means that in situations of hazards, people are in many cases, have to shelter elsewhere. So the idea that this is a new normal, that we're going to have more events that are more damaging, means that we need to start thinking about a future where we have to really shelter in place, and we have to be able to understand how to manage our own property. So that is the idea behind RHOnDA, which is a resilient home online design aid. It's an online tool, and it's intended to make resilience and sustainability research, which there's a lot of out there, useful and accessible to a broader population. When we think about a broader population, we're thinking about that majority of homeowners and tenants who don't have access to that information or to the kind of professional advice that higher value assets have. So the idea is that we're also, as a research project, thinking about this as a kind of feedback loop, which is a very essential aspect of resilience. Thinking about adapting means also thinking about how do we incorporate new knowledge into the way we reorganize our built environment. So we start with the idea that we have already resilience assessments about the built environment. We know a little bit about what makes buildings more or less resilient. We have to combine that with building and neighborhood data to understand where are the highest vulnerabilities. And the vulnerabilities have to do with risk as well as with the characteristics of the population. We use that information to do modeling of the building fabric and understand what are the more, let's say, likely scenarios to cause most damage. And then we use that to create this tool that would provide user education and provide the opportunity for that user to respond to the information given to them. That last piece is the piece that's critical for our next steps of the project, which is figuring out how do we get information back from the user about how the information made them rethink how they're doing things or how they might implement different kinds of mitigation strategies. So what's more effective about this information so that we can better organize the research and the educational tools to reach and sort of promote mitigation strategies. So what we're doing, we started with sampling data. There's publicly available data. That's 10 minutes? Oh, 5 minutes. Okay. Okay, good. I have plenty of time. All right. So we started sampling data that's available in publicly available databases. For example, assessment databases from cities have information about individual buildings, which will tell you things not only like the address and the zip code, but also the building area, the construction type, and such. And some databases are more detailed than others and more accurate than others. We started sampling by looking at generally what are the building types each database has. So we look at, a number of different building types like single family, row houses, triple deckers, duplexes, etc. And each metropolitan area has kind of slightly different combination of building types. We limited it to buildings under 4 stories, and the reason for that is that buildings above 4 stories usually have systems that require a kind of property manager, elevators and such, and so they generally have access to professional advice. So we're looking at the lower urban fabric that tends to either be self-managed or condo associations who are working with relatively low amount of management. There's also building code implications to that decision. Then we identify the building types, which you see on the right-hand side. This is the case of Boston. We did also sampling in San Francisco and Miami to capture different climate conditions. But these are, what we call the Decker single-family duplex row houses and low-rise apartment buildings. These are what we were able to kind of categorize from that data. Then we were basically randomizing a sample of each of those. We have 40 units across Boston. By randomizing them, we mapped them out to make sure that we actually have a sample that is broad and not concentrated in specific places. And then we looked at those building types and their physical attributes. We're looking at this also in 3 cities, and we are gathering data from 6 climates so that we can also convert this data into something that applies to other parts of the country, and 11 hazards, things from flooding to earthquakes, hurricanes, etc. The detailed data, we can only get so far with the database. We actually had our students essentially identify when the database has things like the age of the house. That's really important because that tells us things about the construction techniques at the time. There are certain cutoffs when, for example, buildings didn't require insulation or when they didn't require straps for hurricanes for the wind. So we know from the age of the building some things without actually going to the house. We know the size and perhaps can gather some information about construction type. But things like window-to-wall ratio, which is the percentage of the wall that is window, is something that we have to kind of measure. And so our students used street view images from Google Maps and Google Earth, and we estimated, with as close as we could get, the window-to-wall ratio and other attributes about, for example, the color of the siding, which has an impact in heat island effect and all that. And so we created the sample. We modeled the samples for just some general attributes and looked at different orientations. We ran this model with multiple attributes. So each house is modeled, but then represented as if it was facing north or facing south so that we can have a much broader sample than those 40. And then we combine that energy model and that information about the construction type and its vulnerabilities with zip code-based data. So we used the Department of Energy's climate zones, which are, we were able to map them to zip codes. So if you enter your zip code in the tool, we know what climate zone you're in. We looked at risks that are publicly available data about coastal and riverine flood, drought, and other risks from wind and snowstorms, wildfire, seismic, which is available in, for example, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. So we downloaded all that data, and we created a big database with this information. We also included things like social vulnerability index and accessibility scores. The idea is that the tool will ask the users some general information about their house. They'll identify their own building type. They'll say, oh, I have a row house or I have a single-family home. They'll answer some basic questions about it that help us find what model best kind of fits their house. They will tell us things about the size of their house. They don't have to tell us where they live or any personal information. And they give us zip code information, as well as some general answers about their neighborhood. For example, do you have a lot of trees on your street and things like that. And at the end, we ask some questions about general disaster preparedness so that they self-assess how they think they're prepared for a disaster. In the end, they get a kind of customized dashboard with some information about their resilience based on what we know. So it has a summary of the kind of resilient factors and a summary of some comparison to baselines on energy use, as well as what are their biggest risks of those 11 risks that we were looking at. And it has kind of games like this one where they can look at a sort of little drawing of their actual house and show the different projections, for example, of flood, and they can play with the year that they are looking at, like do I care about it 30 years from now or only 10 years from now, as well as projections of mild, medium, or different likelihoods or probabilities of flood. So they get an understanding in a visual way of what these risks are relative to their own home instead of looking at a map, which is a little bit abstract. And then in the end, there's customized and sorted recommendations that they can sort by hazard. So if they're only interested in hurricanes or they're interested in fire or whatever, as well as by physical scale. So that if they're looking at, I'm renovating my whole house, I want to look at what I can do for the whole building. Or maybe I'm only doing the roof this year, so what can I do if I'm only looking at the roof? They can also look at by time scale, if it's before the event or during the event or after the event. And then these have cross-references, which once you pick one recommendation, you can look at other related recommendations. Of course, this has impacts on inequality, because when we map out a lot of the zip code-based data, you can see that risks and demographics are actually usually, you see the highest risk and highest social vulnerability in some areas. So for example, East Boston, which you can see over here, which has the darkest blue, has the highest one of the highest social vulnerability areas, but is also in one of the areas of highest risk of flood. And so we're interested in mapping out these risks against social vulnerability. And we're starting to talk to partners like NOAA to do workshops for testing this tool and starting to obtain information about how this helps people and how people respond to the information. So that's where we are. We're looking at gathering information with user response and also gamifying this tool with someone from Northeastern who specializes in gamifying tools. So that's it. So next we're going to have Eliza Wallace.
I'm very poor at speaking into microphones, so if you can't hear me, please let me know. Okay. Let's see. Oh. Wow. Okay. All right. Sorry, I'm a little discombobulated this morning. No, let's still not. All right. There we go. Michelle thanks you. All right, so it's convenient that I'm going after Michelle because our projects that we're going to be talking about have a lot of overlap. So I'm going to be specifically talking about a project that our agency, Metropolitan Area Planning Council, conducted to provide technical assistance to the group NOAA, which Michelle mentioned earlier, in terms of leading a community-led resistance planning project. So I should also let you know I am an East Boston resident, so kind of a ringer here, I guess. And actually, I noticed that Michelle, the clip of the assessor's records that you show are actually, those are East Boston. That's my neighborhood. So, although my house wasn't on there. So as you saw from the slides Michelle was showing and some slides that I'm going to show you later, East Boston is really surrounded on all sides by water. And so flooding is now, as you can see from this photograph taken March 10th of this year, there's a man kayaking down the street, is now and will continue to be a problem for this neighborhood. So, the Neighborhood of Affordable Housing, which is an East Boston community development East Boston-based community development corporation, created and is leading a project called Climate Care, which identifies and addresses these vulnerabilities that are specific to East Boston residents and small business owners, and addresses those through community workshops and community-led action. So just to let you know a little bit about what these organizations are, I'm from the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. We're the regional planning agency. You heard from Tim Reardon this morning, director of my department, Data Services. We serve the people who live and work in 101 cities and towns, so we have a regional focus. But we also, as you're going to see, do sort of neighborhood-based work from time to time. So we have a broad range of practice areas. Neighborhood of Affordable Housing, like I mentioned before, is an East Boston-based community development corporation. They focus on affordable housing strategies, environmental justice, and things of that nature. So the climate care, the overarching climate care project that we were kind of assisting with in some really targeted ways is a really interesting project that brings together lots of representatives from the sort of traditional resilience planning sphere, so government entities that have jurisdiction over these critical facilities, which, again, like Michelle mentioned, are sort of the sort of key vulnerabilities for neighborhoods, like the MBTA, MassDOT, facilities like that, Massport in East Boston, very important. But also brought this group together along with nearly 20 really engaged community residents and business owners. And you can see a young resident here, Gabriela Ramirez, addressing the working group. And those of you who work in this sphere, actually, I'm right over there. You can see there's a lot of sort of big players in the room, and all kind of giving equal footing and contributing to the same assessment of what are the real vulnerabilities here. So here's where MEPC plugged in. This project focused largely on community outreach and engagement, and creating this working group and working with this working group. But they needed some technological support for doing things like bringing everybody together and then saying, okay, well now what are the facilities that everybody in this room either knows about from living in the neighborhood that are very important for life to return to normal after some kind of storm event, or that your agency or city office has control over, owns, and operates. So you can see that what our agency did was create a really basic web map that's focused on the East Boston neighborhood that includes some really detailed flooding risk data. You can see the different colors represent the percent risk, with the dark blue being the highest risk, and also breaking down the information that we were editing and being provided with by jurisdiction, so that basically someone could sit down and say, okay, well I'm with the Department of Public Health. Let me just look at the assets that I know about and make edits and give information about, say, how far off the floor our backup generator is, things like that. So another challenge was to take that information that we got from this working group and then give it back to people in a way that they're going to be able to consume and understand. So, as you can imagine, living in a neighborhood, you don't necessarily think about the things that are important to your daily life in terms of who owns it or who operates it, right? I mean, you don't think about, oh, well, that's Massport rather than MassDOT, so, it makes a difference. So what we did instead was create a much cleaner, more straightforward web map that's a little easier to read, and broke it down by sort of how important assets are, made it so that the flooding information was a little easier to read. You can see, like, oh, is it at risk? Is it not at risk? Rather than, like, what percentage, to make that a little bit easier for neighborhood residents, such as myself, to consume. And, yeah, like I said, simplified sea level rise data. And then finally, in terms of getting this information into people's hands, we worked with Harvard Graduate School of Design and with NOAA to put together a focus group, a small focus group of residents to create basically to learn from them how residents get information. What are the normal pathways? Where do people get their news? We found that many of them go to the internet. However, a large number of residents get their internet, consume their internet on their phones or tablets rather than on a desktop computer. So that led us to create a mobile-friendly website. Of course, we needed to make it bilingual, because as you most likely know, the Spanish is in some neighborhoods in East Boston more commonly spoken in the home than English. So fully bilingual website, and also created some, so you can see here some examples of some of the calls to action. And you can see the embedded web map here, and here you can see some of the English language text. And then finally, we also heard that many of the older residents who the focus group felt were most vulnerable may not have internet access at all, at least not regularly. So we also created a complementary print campaign that matches it, that builds off of and matches the website. So this is just an example of sort of taking existing technologies, right, nothing overly complicated, but plugging into these few little gaps in such a way that it sort of facilitates the conversation around climate resilience, and also gets that information back to the hands of the people who need it, so that they can do things like, oh, gee, I should clean out my basement so that toxic chemicals, if my basement floods, don't poison my neighbors, or things like that. So. Yes, I think that wraps it up. So then, these are our partners. So NOAA led the project. We also collaborated with Harvard Graduate School of Design. And I do want to give a short plug for our agency. Today is actually my last day at our agency. So if any of you are interested in the work that we do, the work that Tim was talking about and a few people today, take a look at our website. There are a couple of job postings that are open and available. So thank you.
Thank you, Eliza. That was really great. Good luck in your next step.
Thank you.
I believe we're having Nathan Sanders now present.
Thank you so much. Well, really a pleasure and a privilege to be able to join you all today, and what a wonderful panel we have. So thanks to everyone at BARI who made this session possible. So I'm joining you today as a volunteer representative of the Mystic River Watershed Association, and I want to share some of the work that we've been doing and some of the work that we've been doing to try and help and empower other groups as well to use data to inform policy oversight and analysis, particularly in the water quality domain here in Massachusetts. And I want to focus on one aspect of our work today to fit the theme of today's discussions, which is environmental justice, which is really important to what we do. So I'm sure a lot of you are already very familiar with environmental justice, but if you're not, it's a topic area that addresses the problem and recognizes that the most vulnerable communities within the United States have traditionally borne the highest burden associated with environmental pollution and have often had the least access to actually influencing environmental policy. So environmental justice movement has a long history. Many people actually point to Martin Luther King's work with the Memphis sanitation workers strike in the 1960s as part of the origin of the movement. And throughout that time, it has been led by people of color. And I think there are many goals of the movement. Maybe the most concise way to summarize it would be to say that it's seeking to create an equitable distribution of, first, the burdens associated with environmental pollution, two, the benefits associated with high environmental quality, and a third, access to and being able to participate in environmental policy making. So fortunately, environmental justice has been recognized and enshrined as a priority at the federal level, the state level, and by many other organizations. So it is a very active area. And in particular, in Massachusetts, we have a formal definition for what it means to be an environmental justice community. So I just wanted to make this really concrete by sharing it with you. And it has to do with three different demographic factors. There's a specific definition as to what constitutes an environmental justice community in terms of income, in terms of racial demographics, and actually in terms of language as well. There's a definition of what it means to be linguistically isolated, which has to do with how many households have an adult who's fluent in English. And so when I think about environmental justice and the work that I and my organization can do as an advocate in this space, I think of a series of challenges. So the first challenge is to be able to identify the problem, to be able to actually identify the communities that are being disproportionately affected by environmental pollution, The second challenge is to be able to measure that problem, to be able to actually measure the impact that those differential burdens have on these communities. And third, to be able to persuade, to be able to gather that evidence together, to use those measurements to take action and to actually influence the policy debate. And for this whole sequence of challenges, in my view, they're all sort of gated by one thing, which is the access to and the ability to use data to tackle all of these challenges. And this, unfortunately, is not at all easy. In fact, I think a primary problem in this space is that there are wonderful data sets, including many that we've already discussed today, available to do this work. They're often published by different public sector agencies in different formats on different platforms. And for citizens and for small groups, it can be really hard to take those data sets, bring them together, and use them to address specific policy questions that are relevant to the local context. So that's one aspect of the work that we're trying to do at the Mystic River Watershed Association. I just want to give you some background about our group. Oops. Try this one more time. There we go. So MIRA was founded in 1972, actually by Tufts University graduate students. And since that time, its mission has been to protect and restore the Mystic River watershed, including both the land and the water within our watershed. And if you haven't spent time on the Mystic River, I really encourage you to do so. There are beautiful natural resources throughout our watershed. The watershed touches 22 different cities and towns in the Boston area, including Boston itself, particularly in East Boston. And it encompasses about 500,000 residents in eastern Massachusetts. And one of the things that makes the Mystic watershed really unique within our state is that it's incredibly diverse demographically. It ranges from towns on the western side of the watershed, like Lexington and Belmont, that are very wealthy, to towns on the eastern half of the watershed that have really significant environmental justice communities. And in particular, a lot of those towns, Chelsea, Everett, East Boston, have a long history of industrial use, and therefore a lot of history of contamination from industrial pollution. So MIRA has a wide range of activities touching on science, education and outreach, conservation, and more that addresses environmental justice and many other issues. I'm just going to focus on one aspect of the work that we do, which is our policy committee, which is composed of MIRA staff and volunteers like myself. So I want to share with you some of the work that we do. And in particular, I want to talk about a tool that we've been building that we're calling AMEND, the Archive of Massachusetts Environmental Data. AMEND is a website that you can visit today. The link is at the bottom of the slide here. And the mission of AMEND is to empower citizens and other stakeholders to be able to bring together data sets related to environmental regulation to build evidence-based policies and take action in the policy domain. So let me show you some of the resources that are on the site today that we're using to do that. There are a variety of data sets that we've already integrated, and I think we've really just scratched the surface of what would be useful in this context, but we already have a variety of data sets from the US EPA, Massachusetts DEP, and many other sources that are already a part of the resource. These data sets are integrated in the sense that they're combined into a single database that you can interactively query online through our website, that you can download to your own computer and build into your own analyses, or that you can even call as a web service to power other web applications. And we've also published a variety of analyses on the website. And of course, our focus tends to be topics that are particularly of interest to our group and our Watershed Association. We hope they're of interest to others too. But I think more importantly, these serve as examples and templates for the type of questions that other groups can ask that may or may not be on our radar. And to empower other groups to do that, we've made this entire resource open access. All of the source code is published online, both to run the website itself, and that underlies the statistical analysis that we've already published on the site. So this code can be reviewed, modified, and even republished by any other group that's interested in this type of work. So I want to conclude by showing you a particular case study of how we've applied this AMEND resource to environmental justice, and one particular area, which is combined sewer overflows. So sometimes people are shocked to learn that the way many of our sewer systems in Massachusetts are designed is to actually intentionally discharge raw and partially treated sewage into rivers, which of course poses a very serious bacterial contamination threat to public health, and also has really severe ecological consequences for the environment. And there's a very legitimate reason why they're built this way, which is that a lot of our infrastructure in New England is very old, and it was originally designed as a combined sewer system that commingles stormwater with the sanitary sewage that comes from our houses and buildings. And what that means is when there's a lot of rainfall and the stormwater inundates the system, it has to overflow somewhere. Naturally, it's diverted into rivers, but unfortunately, it does carry the sanitary sewage with it. So this is a very well-known problem that a lot of amazing work has actually happened right here in Massachusetts to help mitigate, but still today there are hundreds of millions of gallons of sewage discharged into our rivers every year. And so a key question is, do these discharges overburden certain populations, or is that risk equitably distributed? So fortunately, this is a question that we can answer. So there's wonderful data on environmental justice communities that's being published by the EPA, telling us what neighborhoods have different vulnerabilities. And this is made available by the EPA at the census block group level, sort of the neighborhood level. And there's also, unfortunately, in my view, not nearly as much as there should be, but there is some access to data on where combined sewer overflows happen. So unfortunately, it's actually not required by the state that water districts tell people when they make these discharges, although there's legislation in the State House now that would make that required. But fortunately, there's been some work by the New England Center for Investigative Reporting and others to make some data on this available, particularly for the year 2011, so we have that to bring to bear. So what we've done is to combine that data together. There's interactive maps that you can view on our site that tell you where these combined sewer overflow discharges happen and how that lines up with where environmental justice communities are, both at the census block group data, but also gathered up to the watershed level and the municipal level. So one of the things that, of course, we were very interested in is where our own Mystic River watershed falls within other peers in the state. And it turns out that in terms of environmental justice populations, the Mystic River watershed has the highest level of linguistic isolation of any watershed in our state, so the highest level of households that don't have a fluent English speaker. And unfortunately, it turns out that there's actually a very significant correlation between where these combined sewer overflows happen and the level of linguistic isolation. So it turns out that for about every 4% of additional households that are linguistically isolated in a watershed, there tends to be an additional roughly 200 million gallons of sewage discharged into those watersheds per year. So what that means is that, for a variety of reasons, and whether intentional or not, we've ended up with a water infrastructure system in our state that substantially overexposes vulnerable communities to the bacterial impacts of sewage. And that's actually true with respect to linguistic isolation, racial demographics, and income as well. So unfortunately, this isn't a problem that we can solve single-handedly as an organization, but we can certainly bring attention to it, and we can make recommendations for policy solutions. And so we do that through our policy committee by participating in the comment process related to developments that are happening in our watershed, and by testifying on behalf of and in opposition to legislation that affects this issue. So for anyone else who's interested in this area of policy, I hope the specific resource that we've created, Ahmed, can be really useful. If your focus is on a different area, I hope that our work might serve as an interesting model for how individual volunteers, individual citizens, and also small organizations can take a really active role in policy analysis and debate. And I want to conclude with one more thing, which is to point out a group that I think really needs to be more involved in this process, which is the scientific community, scientists. So unfortunately, in my view, we have a preparation system for scientists today that actually doesn't emphasize the skills that scientists need to participate in the policy debate. And in particular, I think we don't train scientists well enough to communicate with the public and to communicate outside of their discipline. So fortunately, there are lots of great organizations that are trying to address this. And one of them is based right here in Boston. It's an organization called CommPsych, the Communicating Science Conference series that I'm proud to be a part of. It's a series organized by graduate students for graduate students, and it's preparing young scientists and empowering them to become leaders in the communication of science and ambassadors for their field. So CommPsych's national workshop, which features young leaders from across the country, takes place here in Boston every summer, and there's also a network of regional CommPsych franchises across the country. So if you share my perspective that scientists need to be more involved in the policy process, I'd welcome you to go to CommPsych.com and learn more about the organization. Thank you very much.
So Ahmed's going to be our last presenter.
Hi everyone, my name is Ahmed from Northeastern University. So I will present one of my projects at Northeastern. I did it with my advisor, Professor Peter Fair. It's related to bus transit service. So first of all, before I go to this slide, how many of you use the bus to commute every day? Raise your hand. Okay. Some of you, so you know that this bus service is slow and reliable, and yeah, and considering that disadvantaged community rely a lot on it, this is unacceptable. So MiniCity consider applying some strategy to protect the bus from congestion, but they need a tool to measure the cost and justify their investment in this strategy, like having bus lane or applying transit signal priority. So our project is we develop a tool to measure the cost that traffic congestion impose on operating cost and on bus users. So our tool is basically we're just comparing the traffic congestion to the low traffic period by clustering the traffic congestion over the time of the weekday. This is going to give you the impact based on average, but we have also to consider the variability due to higher demand and on peak period. So first, how we measure the cost. The cost is, for the operating cost, is the average increase the running time cost, and the variability increase the recovery time cost. The recovery time is the time that transit agency add to the running time of the route in order to start the next trip on time, to be on time. Then the cost on bus user is the average increase the in-vehicle time, and also increase the variability, increase the waiting time, and the buffer time. The buffer time is the time you put to make sure that you will be in your destination on time. The value we used, we took it from the Department of Transportation, and the data we use data that is collected normally every day by MBTA. We use the automated vehicle location data, and we use the automated passenger count data. There's different kind of data. We mainly focus on the announcement record data, which show us each time when the door open and which time when the door closes of the bus. So first of all, we just try to exclude the time caused by passenger, and using the automated passenger count data, we estimate the time took the passenger to get in and out of the bus, and which is 4.3 seconds and 1.8 seconds for getting out of the bus. And there's a rule of thumb value we use. Transportation is 14 seconds took the bus to stop and to move. And then to measure the variability, we said there is a variability in the schedule and there is variability in the demand. We measure the variability in the demand and the schedule, and we exclude this from each time period. And there is also variability that it exists all the time, unavoidable, and there is variability with the operating strategy, like starting early or late. This one, we assume that it's affect equally in all the period. Then when we exclude also this variability, we're stuck with the traffic congestion variability impact. So there is more details how we measure the variability on the time, on the waiting time and the buffer time. I will not go over that. This example of the cost on route number 1. So if we look to the time, to the adjusted time of the route, then the recovery time and the ideal recovery time, we see the increase. This is the ideal, this should be, and this is the increase. Also with the excessive wait time, it's increased. For example, in the midday, it's around 6 minutes. And for for the in-peak, it's around 1.2 minutes. Calculating the cost, then to stay here. So just the cost is around 7 million for the annual cost caused by traffic congestion on the route number 1. We did this for 10 bus routes in Boston area. And I see the value here. Then we said we use the scheduled bus time that MBTA published to just try to measure the average, the cost caused by increasing in the mean running time. And we compare this with using automated vehicle data, and it's almost can do the same. But the variability, you still have to use the automated vehicle location data. So to conclude this, so the impact of traffic congestion, 20% almost on operating cost, and 80% on the user, and 50% caused by increasing in average, 50% all increasing by the variability. This tool can justify the using bus lane, and we still need better data from MBTA because the data has a lot of problems. Okay. And that's all.
Thank you for your presentations. I'm going to ask that we join at the table, and I'd like to maybe have a a particular project presented or sort of general conversation starters. I think it was very interesting to see the use of data in different ways to organize information about how people, especially lower income communities, are affected by various aspects of environmental quality or hazard threats, or even access to good public transportation. So why don't I open it for someone in the audience who might have questions for anyone in specific or for all of us?
So for your language rule, so I think I followed it up to where you're showing impact on a particular building. But I wasn't sure then how you were giving full advice on what they can do to the building.
Sure. So the database we built essentially looks at asking a series of questions of the user, and we identify what factors in those questions, the answers to those questions, suggest that there is an increased vulnerability. For example, if the age of the house that they report is before hurricane ties were required in building codes, and the person responds to the question, have you had a structural renovation of your roof since such date, we are able to glean that this is probably a house that needs a retrofit of the roof structure for increased wind. If that is matched with a high risk of wind damage in that particular zip code, then we filter the recommendations we have to show the recommendations related to high wind impacts in that particular construction type. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so then the tool generates a report based on.
Yeah, there's a customized list of recommendations based on the answers to the questions and the risk information. Any other questions?
As you just quoted, the increasing clarity that you have around wondered if there's an opportunity to create sort of a family checklist or neighborhood checklist that can be disseminated broadly to nonprofit organizations and community-based organizations so that we start having a more shared understanding of capacity building toward the end of resilience, and that many organizations who might not resonate with that word or think of their work in that way, but who are doing the work of building those skills, might be starting to move in a similar direction. Because I just see a lot of sort of emerging similarities that can be translated pretty quickly, I think, into shared language for capacity building organizations and agencies.
That's a really interesting question. I'm going to suggest maybe Eliza can take that on.
Yeah.
So what you're doing.
Yeah, I think so. I think that kind of idea is really similar to a lot of the work that NOAA has been doing, and most likely that they're going to pursue through the community care project as well. So right now they already have. You could see on the website that I showed. WeCareEastBoston.org, by the way. I think it's printed in your booklet if you want to look it up. Things like suggestions on basement cleanouts, for example, and I think part of it is that yes, those checklists are great and useful, but it also needs to be accompanied by a real push to get it into people's hands. So one thing that NOAA does in East Boston is they do like really door knocking, sort of really on the ground. People go to houses and talk to homeowners and explain and sort of take it that extra step. But yes, I think that kind of resource is important.
Yeah, I would add to that I think there's need for research on what kinds of information are more likely to result in action, because there's a lot of checklists out there, and I mean, part of the problem is that there's a lot of people looking at resilience and writing recommendations, and they're all in different places. So if an individual person or an individual organization tries to gather this information in one place and try to make sense of it, you need a significant amount of resources and time just to make sense of all of the different resources. So there definitely needs to be an effort at trying to understand how people interact with that data, with that information, how do they respond to it, so that the parties that are more likely to want this action to happen can understand how to best organize that information and how to best present that information. There are two groups principally that are very interested in issues of mitigation and climate change, the government and insurance companies. Insurance companies have seen, there's a report that came out recently that showed that for every $1 they spend on mitigation, they save $4 in claims, which involve anything from property to time loss to, as you know, time loss has a lot of value, as Ahmed showed us, or even deaths, etc. And then there are, the government sees savings of up to $6 for every $1 they spend in mitigation. So the federal government and state governments are starting to realize that there is a lot of impact in investing in mitigation, but how to make that mitigation happen, who pays for it, how to incentivize people to do it. So the question of incentivizing requires thinking about how the data is presented, thinking about and understanding how people respond to that information. So that's a part of really research that needs to happen so that we can make better lists, better checklists, and we can better understand who are the players who are more likely to have a kind of impact in that, but I agree, part of that is really finding the common language, and it's hard to find common language when we don't necessarily understand how different people react to the information. So I think there's a kind of social science component to this that, I'm an architect, that's not what I do, but I'm looking to partner with people who do this, who are researchers in kind of the social sciences and communications to understand that.
Maybe a complementary point of view on this, which I think that type of centralization of information, having a one-stop shop checklist is really useful. I think at least as useful is to decentralize that information, make sure that it gets to people in the context where it's important today you go to a part of the Mystic River that has one of these discharge pipes, you'll often see as a sign that says something along the lines of MWRA 0452, something like that, which is, to someone who's in the know about this, is an indicator that this is where there's a discharge pipe, and when it rains, there's bacterial contamination and sewage flowing out of that pipe, and you shouldn't go near the water. But for someone who doesn't know what that means, it provides no information. So making sure that there really is some informative signage to address an issue like that, and I'm sure for issues of housing, making sure that when people are in context where they're making decisions about their home and the building choices that they make when they're occupying the home, I think that's at least as important as providing a type of centralized checklist information.
Any other questions or comments?
Well, so I'm sort of pondering in the background of all these presentations is the question of, so who or what organization is going to use the information for what purpose, where they have, the incentive to invest in the decision-making process,
Yep.
which is something that sort of came up in the opening remarks this morning. And Nathan was referring a lot to the way Myra feeds information over into like the legislative hearings and the agency proceedings and the comment periods, whereas some other parts of this panel talked about individual people with their individual property who, in whatever way, have autonomous authority to think about when my basement floods. So I don't know if this is a question, but that's a dilemma in itself, especially when you start talking about it's very time sensitive. Licenses come up at a particular time. Implicitly, it seemed to me like all of you might have been thinking about, so how could the building codes be changed, or how could the municipal zoning requirements be changed so that people either have to get their roofs inspected at a certain time, or there are legal requirements that could be put in place, but then you have to advocate for those procedures to put new responsibilities on individuals, perhaps, or maybe the utilities themselves who provide sewer overflows need to have new obligations where you need to target a different decision-making process. So that's just putting out on the table. There's in the background there are a lot of unresolved questions about who and why and how are the decisions going to be made and what legal requirements frame those forms.
That is an absolutely fantastic question, and one that I think we all need to think about really seriously. In our specific work, we talk about disseminating information to users, being the homeowner, the tenant, to empower them to think about decision-making, but we also acknowledge that that decision-making may not be in their hands. If you're a tenant, you may not actually be able to make changes to the building you live in, but you may have the ability to advocate on your behalf, or to organize, or to speak at hearings, or at least sort of advocate at a kind of neighborhood level for certain measures. And so that's one part of it. The other part of it is that we see the users as different than perhaps the institutions that might actually want to disseminate the tool, because that's where governments or insurance companies or utility companies might actually have more use of that tool, because they are interested in incentivizing mitigation at a local user level, but the user doesn't have an incentive to do it unless they understand the impacts on their own property, or understand the connection between that particular mitigation strategy and a, let's say, a discount in insurance or something like that, right? So there's a question of who are the interested parties who would want to actually make this information available, and what are they to gain from that? Part of the difficulty with building codes, which you brought up, is that, for example, here, at least in Massachusetts, you're not necessarily forced to bring your house to code every time the code changes. You're only required to bring it to code when you actually decide to make a change on the house, and it only, or on any building, and it may only be triggered if you're only renovating a certain percentage of the structure. If you're only doing something relatively cosmetic, you're not required to bring it up to code. So the bringing it up to code, or even exceeding codes, because there's a lot of discussion about how we may actually have to exceed codes in order to really protect ourselves from what's coming next, because building codes are based on historic data, which is now starting to be obsolete. So in order to do that, incentivizing going beyond code or doing code related upgrades that are not required, you need to be able to incentivize people by understanding other impacts or other, other carrots, I guess, rather than the kind of legal stick. Unless the regulations change, like I believe in some parts of California, they are actually starting to require certain seismic upgrades. But then there's the question of who pays for it, right? So these are very disadvantaged communities and that are being very impacted. Housing quality is usually tied to income, so the people who need the housing improvements the most tend to be the ones who are least capable of paying for them. So, but that's why these reports that organizations like NIPS put out there, the National Institute of Building Science, are really helpful because the government can see, oh, we might be able to pay $1 here and save $6 later, so then you can make the argument for actually paying for those upgrades. And I think Nathan's idea of, understanding these connections between language, barriers, and environmental conditions might also incentivize others to understand, the kind of ways in which policy needs to change or the reasons why we might invest in that. I do have a question for Ahmed, though, related to that question of incentives, because a lot of these costs, you said 80%, I believe, of the cost are borne by the user, and 20% by its operational costs. When I see something like $7 million in cost for waiting or just having that extra buffer time to deal with this frustrating experience every day, what is the incentive for the MBTA to make changes when the user is bearing the cost, right? Has there been discussions or thoughts on that in your field?
The problem is not just MBTA, just with the municipalities.
Sure.
So MBTA wanted to have cost there and not think a priority that the city, because if you give a possibility, that's what they think about. Yes, you are helping traffic, helping
Sure.
other traffic. Okay.
Right.
So you have to choose between these two, or you have to have this discussion always.
Yeah.
The route that's run between cities, like between Boston and Cambridge, is another issue.
Right. So you're putting one group of people who are dependent on public transportation against another group of people who are dependent on their own private mode of transportation. It's a difficult question, right, in terms of who bears the cost, who pays for any improvements, right? Any other thoughts on this or questions or thoughts from you all about each other's presentations?
One question actually for both Michelle and Eliza, which is about your interaction with NOAA, which is a wonderful goal for your organization. And it's fantastic to see them collaborating with academia, collaborating with big public agencies. I was wondering how that partnership got started and how you cultivate that.
Well, I think the partnership with MAPC is further along than ours. We actually reached out. NOAA reached out to us. Somehow they found out about what we were doing. They said they were interested in looking at our collaboration. But we were still very early on in the stage of development. And when we were finally ready to do it, then we reached out to them like, oh, you're still interested? And we're actually, the funding that we had for the research and the development of the tool was just for the research and development, which is interesting. They give you money and they say, here, make a really cool tool, but they don't ask you to actually use it. But we were interested in actually using it and gathering information from the users. And for that, you really need a community partner. So we reached out to them, and we're now working together. They're acting as our collaborators in pursuing research funding from NSF or other foundations to try to be able to pay for the time of the door knockers who have to go with the tool to go visit, an elderly person who perhaps doesn't speak English and help them use the tool so that we can gather information. So that's the stage that we're at. We haven't yet received the funding. We just submitted a grant a couple months ago, so we're waiting on that. But our hope is that we can do that, and if not, at least have some small amount of funding to do at least at kind of workshop level, similar to what you guys did, and sort of gather everyone in a room, perhaps not go door to door, but it's critical to have those kinds of partnerships if you want the research to actually be applied, and you want to obtain additional information from users engaging with that tool.
And in terms of MAPC's involvement with NOAA, I mean, we've worked with them on other kinds of initiatives, like some of our housing work overlaps and sort of interacts with what they do. In terms of the climate work, I would say that most likely the sort of impetus for our involvement was sparked from the mayor's coalition, a group of 15 cities and towns that make up the sort of the innermost core of Metro Boston. They had over the past couple of years assembled a climate task force, which really gathered the mayors and also sort of large institutions, state institutions, Massport, MassDOT, et cetera, around a table. And so sort of all the government people kind of knew each other and we're talking to each other from the cities and from the state. And the way NOAA sort of plugged into that is that through this climate care project that they were running, they were bringing in the same sort of climate resilience officers, people heading environment departments in cities and towns, bringing those people together, and it ended up that one of them sort of knew that they had a need for some kind of data collection and mapping, knew that MAPC offers those kinds of services, and so they contacted us. We realized it was something that we really wanted to do, and so that's how the initial that sort of data collection piece got started. Once we collected the data, well, we weren't going to just sit on it. I mean, we're a public agency. We're very serious about our commitment to making sure data is publicly available, and so sort of once we were in it, we had to stay in it and follow up on the second part of that, which is taking and turning it around into a communication tool. So it's through those sort of regional partnerships and contacts.
I believe we are 4 minutes over our time. So I hope you all enjoyed the presentations. Thank you for your great questions, and thanks to the panelists for a wonderful. I really learned a lot from all of you today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day in the conference. Thank you.